Hello, all, and welcome to Essence of Wonder. We're happy to have you here today. I've been personally trying to get this show on the road for something like 6 months or so with a great partner, which was Matt. And of course, we have Karen joining us today as a co host. Hi, Karen. How are you doing today?
Hi, I'm great. Thanks, Gadi. How are you?
I am really excited. That's a joke that's growing really old. But no, seriously, I first encountered Strategy Strikes Back, I think in a random bookshop, might have even been at an airport. And I was like, what's that? Because it was obviously Star Wars, but it had the word strategy in it. And hopefully, when you see the word strategy, it wouldn't be about marketing. So I picked it up and I read the first chapter, and it blew my mind because the concept of being able to speak a global language when you don't have terminology such as, for example, in this case, the Civil War, the World War II, to talk with people around the world and they all know Star Wars was amazing for me. And then reading the first chapter with Max's speech to the Senate blew my mind. And I was in. I became a policy geek right in that minute, even if I wasn't before. Have you read the book?
I have. I've read at least the first part of it, and I completely agree. It's a brilliant insight that teaching strategy, discussing strategy with people around the world is difficult because of a lack of shared context or the same view of complex events that fiction, provides a unique outlet to be able to have those conversations. I will say I started reading this book saying, oh, my friend Gadi wants me to read this book. And I think I got two sentences in before saying, oh, shit, I see why.
Do you know why you said that when you saw why?
I can say like it hooked you from the second sentence, like
Yeah, but
literally.
what was it? I'm putting you on the spot.
Okay, I have it. I have it on my phone. I'm going to pull up what the second sentence was, and then I will tell
And
you.
we'll wait for you and hear what the second sentence was.
All right.
And
The
yeah.
uh, the okay. The second sentence is, and this is Matt. I've been on both the wrong end of incoming insurgent fire and the receiving end of cadets' blank stares, and if I were forced to decide between the two, I'm not sure I could.
Matt, this is a perfect chance for you to come in.
So, so yeah, thank you so much. I'm Matt Cavanaugh, and really, this book is a response to a problem. So I had been teaching at West Point, and there's a gap in age between cadets. They're college students, and when you're a professor, and that gap seems insurmountable at times. The jokes don't land. You're just you're a fish out of water, to say the least. And I went from that assignment to an assignment in Korea, where I'm working with South Korean army officers that just don't have the same sense for modern war and strategy that I do. And so, I was really searching for a way to connect across cultures, across generations. And really, we landed on Star Wars because it's the universal war. It's the one war we all know something about. And so it created that common terrain that you could have a conversation about some of these really important and meaty and weighty issues on.
So you've been with you actually earned the West Point Abgar Award for excellence in teaching, right? You served as an associate fellow with the Royal United Services Institute, I believe that's in the UK. You're on the advisory council for the Wounded Warrior Project, and of course, you co-wrote and co-edited with Max Brooks' Strategy Strikes Back and Winning Westeros. In other words, you're an expert, and bringing strategy to the masses. There is a sentence I love about strategy. I don't remember exactly where it's from right now, but have you read Against the Gods?
No,
History of Risk?
no.
So Against the Gods, you have the
Hear about this,
picture.
Gadi. I was like, what's that art piece that makes you cry about this?
So right at the beginning, you have a Rembrandt with people in a boat on the Sea of Galilee fighting the storm, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you say against the gods, and it goes through this entire process of talking about what created modern man or modern humanity, if we're to be more inclusive, and what made the world the way it is. When we've had democracy before, we had philosophically advanced and technologically advanced civilizations before. What makes us now what we are now? And of course, there are endless theories in history about that. you should know. But this was about, we learned to take risks. We learned that we actually have a chance of affecting the world around us, of reading the Iliad, reading Homer, and how everybody would die to try to get through their fate, because the only control they had was over how much the virtue, how much they took it, right? Yeah. And Machiavelli making the shift, and I'll stop here, because this isn't about me, into we can actually control, we can actually affect our lives, and that's where strategy comes in, which is the only way we can really do anything about it. And to do that, to bring strategy to people in a way that's accessible, in a way that people want to read about it and learn about it. I was in love with your book from the very beginning. But maybe this is a chance for us to get started, and we can introduce the other panelists.
Absolutely.
So at this stage, the floor is yours.
Okay, so what we essentially did was I was on my way back.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I actually am sorry. I was supposed to introduce people, wasn't I? Oh, man.
I mean, I can go in order, or
you can go on and on about these people, but I don't want to put you on the spot. I apologize about that. I will blame too much cough medicine. Really, I actually mean it. But I'll do this. I'll be happy to introduce these people, and I apologize to you for putting you on the spot, even though you're capable of doing it. So, of course, Max Brooks, very, very famous around the world for many different things, but of course, World War Z, and of course, the 2013 hit movie with Brad Pitt. He also kind of inspired by himself the military in the US to look at how it prepares for future warfare, right? He's spoken at the Naval War College, FEMA, countless other government agencies. We have August Cole, again, spoken and was acknowledged at various stages, from the Nobel Institute in Oslo to South by Southwest, West Point. He co-authored Ghost Fleet, a novel for the next World War, and Burning, a novel for the real robotic revolution, which is awesome. We have Steve Leonard, who serves as the Director of Assessments for the University of Arkansas School of Business. He chairs the graduate program in organizational leadership and supply chain management. And he's also a former senior military strategist and the creative force behind the defense microblog, Doctrine Man. And now that I've done that, I will apologize again and hand it over to you.
So essentially, there was this nugget or a kernel of an idea, and that's where a lot of books begin. But, in order to better understand whether or not there was actually a there, I reached out to both August and to Max. And from the very first message that I sent to them, I actually went back and looked it up. I've been knocking around an idea, and I thought I'd bring it to you first, as I think you have the best take as writers that sit between the world of fiction and nonfiction. And I think that's the theme that you're going to get out of the rest of us in this talk. There's a dangerous line between the worlds of fiction and nonfiction. I just bumped into my neighbor who's a librarian, who told me a story about a teacher who came to her and said, "I'm looking for a book on animals for kids." And then the librarian responded, "Would you like fiction or nonfiction?" And the teacher said, "What's the difference?" And I think you can sort of almost draw a straight line between that and some of the misperceptions that led to the January 6th riot in the US Capitol. The value of the gentlemen that are on this panel to both the United States and the world is that they know how to leverage that line and to play with it and to do it responsibly and to do it for benefit. Because really, we know how important this is. The 9/11 Commission told us that 9/11 was essentially a failure of imagination. And I think these three other writers are successes when it comes to imagination. So I'm actually going to start with August, who I think is fascinating as a writer in the sense that he starts in the dark world of reporting, as a Wall Street Journal reporter, and eventually migrates over to writing fiction, fantastic fiction that I've actually consumed and then used as analysis for how I conduct myself as an Army officer. So I want to start with August. How was it that you decided to get pulled over into that world, from nonfiction to fiction?
Matt, thank you. And again, this is a great opportunity to just spend some time with you, but also for all the listeners and viewers. This is something that I think you'll hear from probably all the panelists, but we feel in our bones that this is a really important, endeavor. And that sense of purpose is something that has been imbued in my writing. In large part, that's what led me to want to be a journalist when I started out. And I got to a point, though, in that field where I thought I'd reached like the summit. I was working at the Journal in DC, covering the defense industry, really interesting, I think important stories, the hacking of our, most advanced weapons programs by the Chinese, or, covering security contractors like Blackwater. But a lot of what I wanted to write about was tied to things that hadn't happened yet. And I felt like a really good investigative story, or even a snap analysis, on Deadline, can help people understand as much what's going on, but also like what shouldn't happen next. And that's just not how newspapers work, and I should have known that, because I've been working as a journalist at that point for over a decade, but that's just the way my brain was, essentially telling me to go. And I got to a point where I was not really happy in journalism anymore. And so I made this kind of gambit to quit and, try to pursue something that had been inside me since I was, like in elementary school, reading science fiction. Day by day, I wrote a manuscript that never got published, but it allowed me to, begin this journey and really start to realize that, for example, many of the stories I was covering in the private security world, you get off the phone with somebody and you'd be like, you can't make this, stuff up, except to be a lot more laced with, expletives. And, that's something that I wove into this manuscript, and that ultimately led me, to collaborate with Peter Singer on Ghost Fleet and Burn In. So, these things have a funny way of working out, but it really did require breaking with the kind of traditional and conventional approach. And I think that's something that's unique and consistent through, I think, all three of us here, but many of the contributors to the anthology, which is, we're not trying to do what everybody else is doing in this matter. And whether that's something just internal to the way we're wired, which I think for me is I've come to realize is certainly part of my path, but also because the need is out there for people to try and experiment and maybe fail doing other things.
What's the right balance when you're making useful fiction? Because of course you're using your imagination, but you're also grounding it or anchoring it on some level to the real world, So how do you think about that? Most broadly.
Well, we've come to a point, I think, where, I've started to see almost like a set of rules that can be applied. A really important one is making sure that, technologies, for example, are within the realm of, what's being developed now or exists. Another is that things like Murphy's Law, happen in the future. Those kinds of elements really, I think, anchor these sorts of stories in a world that's recognizable, but hopefully still interesting enough that people feel like their, minds are being expanded.
So
if you don't mind my butting in with a question, do you feel like there are things, an old writing teacher of mine used to say, some things only life can get away with about coincidences. Do you feel like you have to limit that chaos factor? Like you mentioned Murphy's Law, do you feel like you have to limit that highly improbable thing occurs sort of energy in the stories you tell?
That's a really great question. I think one of the confounding aspects of that is technology, right? Because we have this sort of almost omniscience now with our iPhones or whatever device you have on you. So there's that tension between true surprise and ultimate knowledge. And so I think that's something I'm still working out in everything I write, to be honest.
Thank you.
So let me move us over to Max, just because I think he's in exactly the 180-degree opposite direction, and I'm excited if he wants to push back on me on that. But Max, it seems to me that you actually started in the world of funny and the world of fiction, and then you're sort of being pulled in like gravity towards nonfiction a little bit more. Am I wrong when I say that? Have you been kind of pulled in the opposite direction, or was it always there to begin with?
I think the desire was always there. I just didn't have the avenue. I was always much more fascinated when I was a kid reading about realistic fiction. I loved Tom Clancy's work because it was fascinating, and I felt educated and I felt smarter. As opposed to Ian Fleming's sort of psychosexual, middle-aged Viagra male fantasy books, which I have no use for. So I wanted to be a writer like Clancy. I didn't have the avenue for it until I was able to write my zombie books, which really just are survival books. Zombie Survival Guide is a survival book for individuals or small groups. World War Z is a survival guide for systems and for countries. And so then I got pulled in, first Naval War College. Then when I met August Cole. He said, would you like to be part of the Atlantic Council's, Art of Future Warfare? And he's a foot taller than me. So I looked him right in the chest and I said, I'm in. And then you and I met, and we talked. Then I met you in person. I was like, oh my God, he looks just like Captain Jonathan Archer from Enterprise. So I always thought that the best way to engage the public in a democracy where we are the boss is tell them a great story, because we are emotional beings. Make them laugh, make them cry, make them feel, get them invested, get them rooting for somebody. And then through that, educate them about their role in this club that we call a republic.
Do you just start with pure curiosity? And then I've heard you talk in the past about the balance between pure education and pure entertainment. I mean, do you sort of start with something that just interests you, and then as you're working through the subject, you're looking for hooks into both? Is that how it?
Yeah, it always has to start with me, and it always has to start with a simple question that I set out to answer. Like, what if there was a real zombie plague?
Yes.
How would it really happen? And then that's my compass needle, and it directs everything. And having grown up, I have the advantage of growing up in show business and understanding how much of it is just BS and understanding how much of it is just put in there for mindless entertainment. So I knew, watching so many other zombie stories, most of these people, it doesn't matter how great you are with an AR-15 or a big, a 44 Magnum. Mm-hmm. You drink out of a puddle, you will diarrhea yourself to death. And the reality of it, to me, answering the real questions is infinitely more interesting than having to upload it with faux tricks just to engage the audience. Because I think the audience is much smarter than we give them credit for. So
I need to preface this. You have one of the best audiobooks ever. 15 years ahead of what they're doing with Pushkin Industries and trying to make books more immersive and interesting. How do you consume fiction and nonfiction? I know reading it can be a challenge, but is it just a blend of visual and audio, and then some books? How do you sponge up the content that you come into contact with?
Well, I'm very dyslexic, so school was not easy for me. So I always had to find alternative means. And so my mother started by taking all my school books and bringing them to the Braille Institute and having them read as audiobooks. So because I was tested and I learned that I take in information more through my ears than through my eyes. So the way I take in information now is, if it's for just pure entertainment, it's an audiobook. But if it's for research, it's audiobook combined with the hard copy. Like, for example, like reading a book like this, I'm listening to the audiobook, but then as we go, I pause it so then I can dog you and give me notes as I go. So there's a variety, but I have to say dyslexia is probably what set me on this path, because it didn't come easy for me. So how do you educate someone who doesn't learn the way other people are learning? Which is what's going through my mind every time I'm going to an Atlantic Council conference or a Modern War Institute conference, and I'm watching these PhDs just drone. And I think you're only reaching your tiny little group of sheepdog, not the sheep like me. That's
in many cases in cybersecurity, what we call this is admiring the problem.
Yes. And you've got these professors, and they're very good at talking to their students. But then I would go back to my hotel room.
Inquire, if you will.
None of these issues were on any of the news channels, regardless of your political stripe. And that's death in a democracy. So that initial problem of my dyslexia sort of set me on this path, which is, how do you educate people who want to learn but don't know how?
Yeah. And I'm glad to see, by the way, that you prefer the Post-it notes in books. I'm glad that someone else is supporting 3M. And Post-it notes. I'm gonna move it over to Steve, because Steve is incredibly famous in the military world, and I'll tell you how famous he is. At the office where I work at NORAD and U.S. Northcom. The binational Canadian U.S. Command for Homeland Defense. And at the fridge, in the middle of the planning the place where the planners hang out, there's this huge blown up web comic, and it's essentially it's different. It's what the general says and then what the staff officer hears, and it's a running gag between the two. And I still remember, like, you're, for a while you went, Steve, did you choose not to let people know you were Doctrine Man? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
That's a great question, because I hate to admit it, but I'm like deeply introverted naturally, and so it wasn't so much that I didn't want people to know, as I didn't want the attention drawn from it. And so as that evolved beyond what I ever imagined it would be, I didn't want the attention. I didn't want to divert from what I was trying to do, which was very similar to what you mentioned initially, was, the using a web comic to teach lessons in a few panels, to share something that could entertain at the same time that it conveyed a message, a lesson. And so the cartoon you mentioned, for example, I mean, it's years of working at that level. And, we understand what a general is saying. Somebody else comes into a room and says, hey, he nodded the whole time. It's like he was trying to stay awake. He wasn't actually listening to you. And so, so it's funny, but most people don't understand that stuff. And so you take the things that we would see on a day-to-day basis, put it in a context where others would say, hey, I know that situation, or I know that person, and oh, I get that. It becomes a way to remember something, to teach a lesson.
I have to say, that's a great scene you just wrote right there of a misunderstanding of, like, oh, he was nodding, so clearly we should go do this. No, that's just what he does.
Absolutely.
Coffee. Get the man coffee. Don't invade anyone.
I had one this week that was the same kind of thing, but it's translating British. And if you've ever spent time with the British, they're just so polite, especially the British military. They're so polite. And it takes years of understanding them and reading body language to when they say something, understanding what they really meant. So if you were being disappointing, if you were off the mark, just because they smiled and said, hey, thank you for your time, what they were really saying. And those kind of things are important to teach other people, so they don't have to learn the hard way. Like Matt and I can honestly say, a lot of the lessons that we learned and the things that he described standing in front of students with their eyes glazed over, you don't want people to learn those lessons the hard way. So finding a way, a common medium to translate some lessons and do it in a way that they learn maybe without even knowing they're learning, that's a very powerful tool to use.
So it's not just that they're so polite, it's that they're so well dressed. So I went to a meeting at the Ministry of Defense just before COVID, and it was a group of American officers and a group of British officers. And in their Ministry of Defense, everybody wears civilian clothes. And so the Ministry of Defense, the British military guys are all wearing Savile Row, bespoke, tailored. The Americans, we all looked like we were at junior high prom wearing Dad's like Sunday best. It was really honestly embarrassing. But when you are in the Army, as you were and I am, we have certain creative choices removed from us, to include our smooth haircuts, right? But you struggle sometimes when you're weering the same.
What's this thing you call hair? I'm not sure.
That's right.
I understand.
Right. Others don't ever have that choice. I respect that. So,
yeah, Gadi would be entirely creatively unconstrained, I'm sure, by the military.
Right. Blank slate, tabula rasa. So, Steve, we don't always we have to differentiate ourselves beyond style and clothing choice, that sort of thing. Is that what led to the web comic? Is that what was it a chance for a creative outlet? What got you there? Because really you started in a pretty straight-laced hierarchical organization, but found a way to punch outside of it to build a megaphone to connect with a heck of a lot more people.
Well, it was a combination of of the two, I started out when I graduated from college, probably before August was born. I embarked immediately on a writing career of sorts where I tried to publish at least once a year, and that was back in the days before the internet. And so you had to fight the battle of the print journals, and that was a goal: once a year, a print journal, no matter what. And I did the same kind of things that we do now, but you realize that those stories straight up just don't resonate. And you end up with a lot of glazed over audiences. A few people read what you write, but the stuff you don't hit people. And eventually, my own sense of humor got the better of me. And how that started, it started when I was in the School of Advanced Military Studies, when I started to create cartoons for the first time, and then I realized that there wasn't a faculty member that didn't pull those cartoons up and then use them, and you'd find them, like you say, on a fridge somewhere, and the light came on. And I have no artistic ability, so that's why I use stick figures. But you can convey those messages through a humorous medium. And years later, when I entered, by the time I was a lieutenant colonel, I started to do those just for the office, and then it grew and it grew and it grew, and it just kept growing, and to the point where you've got a couple of 100,000 people a day that look at the cartoon, and it was just a great way to go. And it wasn't ever what I intended it to be. I didn't intend it to be anything more than something that like 10 people I worked with would see every day. We'd all get a laugh, and then we'd go back to work. Just this week, I sent some off to Offutt Air Force Base for a golf scramble that they're going to be giving away as raffle prizes. And those are not the kind of things that you expect, but people come back and say, "Hey, could you give us a couple of copies of these cartoons and sign them?" And blah blah. Max knows what that's like. August knows what that's like. I mean, for us, we don't sign things. That's weird, but hey, is what works. And at the same time, that somebody is going to have that lesson translating general officer sitting up on their wall, and it works, and it does a lot of good for a broader community, and allows us to reach more people.
Fantastic. And that's really what we were looking for. And that's, in fact, not just reaching a lot of folks, but when we pulled together the book, really trying to leverage as many different perspectives on Star Wars as we could. And we focused in on the films, because that's where popular culture, the center of gravity is, so to speak. So we reached out to about 30 different authors with literally hundreds of years of national security experience. Former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, General Stan McChrystal wrote the foreword, which is an interesting story in and of itself, because when I first approached him about writing the foreword, he said, "Well, I'm not really a huge Star Wars fan." But then he backpedaled and said, the first movie that he had seen after he finished Ranger School, which is a difficult physical school that you do as a lieutenant in the U.S. Army, the first movie he slumped into a theater to see was the very first Star Wars. And so, that's a common point of connectivity across several generations. And that's why he ultimately decided to write our foreword. We had a big diversity of submissions. Erica Iverson wrote about the evolution of women's roles at war over time. Admiral Jim Stavridis wrote about hybrid wars in space. But I actually want to start with August, because for me, when the submission first came in, I started, alarm bells went off in my head. Ernie Pyle, Ernie Pyle, Ernie Pyle. And he was probing issues, how war correspondence might change, and from my perspective, that's a perspective that I never would have thought to consider. But of course, it came out of someone who is a recovering journalist. So, August, tell me a little bit about how, why you picked the Battle of Hoth, why you wrote it the way you did. And I'll probably jump in with more questions as we go, because I'm just interested.
Yeah, it's as someone who's a civilian and a former journalist, I'm often the only person, in a lot of the environments that I'm in with that background. So I'm kind of used to being that like outsider, so to speak. And it came natural to turn to that methodology. I felt like, and mentioning Ernie Pyle, that was like on my shelf here, one of the books from the 40s that I have of his, or the 50s, I think it was, that I really wanted to draw upon. He was killed in 1945, I believe. And, his work, though, during the Pacific, theater coverage that he wrote really captured, the nation. And it was unsparing, in showing sort of the horrors of warfare. And, as Star Wars is a series that is, especially in The Empire Strikes Back, quite bloodless in many ways. I wanted to really look at like what the retreat at Hoth, right? I find defeat fascinating, and thinking about this really important battle and how it went awry was important. And so I created this character that was effectively like a droid journalist, a C3U2, that would be able to, in a very stylized way, like Pyle, really give like a grunt's eye view, from the frozen trenches, like what it was like when the AT-AT walkers are coming, and you're going to die, you're going to be defeated, and yet you have to hold the line so these like troop ships can escape. And that I felt like, and it's a pretty like bloody or grim short story, right? The accounting doesn't really kind of hide from that. And if anything, the narrator it describes in the writing like this is what the galaxy has to see.
You chose a robot for a journalist.
Yeah,
sort of your, signaling the death knell for live journalists, living.
What I really found interesting about like a droid journalist was that they could, in this case, it's like a 200-year-old droid, right? So they would really understand the arc of a conflict that is, quite long. And I wanted to capture that and really have some way to really give that perspective and almost like authority, that like the importance of narrative in a battle that's centuries long. And no matter kind of what frameworks you use to look at modern and future conflict, it is important to step back and look at these longer arcs. And I thought, wow, how great would it be to have a character that could see those?
Question: how were you focused on the narrative of a long battle versus literally the like more logistics focused communications within the battle? Because logistics have been logistics of communications have been part of the military forever. Like that's
so in this one it was an interesting way to play with that, and I wanted to get like these almost anthropological aspects right. The essentially rebel soldiers are preparing for this battle. They know it's coming. And so one of the small troops, essentially has their, senior enlisted teaching them how to evacuate each other on, pieces of like shielding that's been like, Teflon coated, right? They're doing it as quote unquote sledding, before the battle starts. But during the fight, for example, these younger rebels realize what they've been taught as they carry away their squad leader, the one who taught them. So things like that, I think, are really helpful to see. And then the other aspect too is that you're looking at like the very technological challenge of like how do you file a story, right? Like every journalist always is thinking about how do I file, and so I had to kind of consider that too, like in the middle of the battle, how does the word get out? It's a burst transmission. But
it's fantastic. This I think is so much more important than I possibly could have imagined, in the sense that it's so important for war correspondents to be able to bring that story to publics, right? To be that conduit to society that's actually funding and fueling a conflict. The other thing that I found fascinating was that we almost presume now that everything is going to be on camera in the future, that there'll be some sort of a satellite getting a perfect image of what's happening. But you chose to kind of go the other route, that this is still text-based, or that you're actually sending a story along for other folks to read. That's in the long arc of the distant future. How about the closer, nearer term, in the next 20 or 30 years? Will war correspondents look more like Ernie Pyle, or will they Sebastian Younger, or are they going to look a lot more like your story?
I think the definition of a correspondent, like in contemporary civilian journalism, what is a journalist is changing, and I think that's certainly true in future conflict as well. The technological barriers to, sharing our own individual stories. I mean, that's monetized, around the clock, around the world, by social media companies. So the platform, that I had to reach 1 million people, at the Journal, right, with a front page story, is now in the hands of, non-combatants and combatants alike. And in fact, I actually see organized groups, like Western militaries, insurgent groups, et cetera, probably leaning heavier into, like live casting and sharing, their narratives, in part because with algorithmic, influence and kind of like micro-targeting, you're going to be able to give people who are, tens of thousands or at least thousands of miles away from a conflict their own individual experience and kind of context for it. That may be, shaped to a national objective or a will, or let people discover that on their own, in a different kind of model. So I think that like this is something that's going to be there. You kind of asked another question in a backhanded way about like the written word, right? Does it have a future in the coverage of conflict? And I certainly think it does. That's a medium that is endured, allows for more reflection. But it may not be what people are reading right away, and it certainly probably is going to be fighting for attention, just like we who write books are with very compact and kind of tightly shot video.
You've heard
nothing. That's not even acknowledging augmented reality and virtual reality, which are an extension of that.
Really great point. You've heard, I hope, Neil Gaiman call books sharks, that they're prehistoric, and that they'll outlive all of us. And I hope that's the case. Although if Max keeps making audiobooks, I'll keep buying those. In Myanmar, generals are ordering civilians to be murdered. There's a group of French generals that are calling for harsher measures against those of the Islamic faith in France. And here in the United States, Mike Flynn is essentially a little ball of rage. And so I use that as a starting point to move over to Steve, because Steve talks about in his chapter, the Jedi as a military profession and what a society should expect of a military profession. And it's a really important question because those examples that I just described show us just how bad it can get. So Steve, I want you to talk just a little bit about why is it just because you thought the Jedi were cool, the Jedi are cool, or is it because you really wanted to showcase what right and what wrong looks like to the world?
So there's actually, you hit on two key points there. One, I mean, honestly, if you don't think the Jedi are cool, then you just kind of missed the whole point of Star Wars. But the other piece of this was, and you remember, we spent years trying to generate a dialogue on the professional arms within the military. And without being obscene, it just didn't hit. Nobody cared. It just didn't stick. No matter how many general officers stood behind a PowerPoint slide and talked about the professional arms, nobody was listening. And you realize that you have people on the 30, 40-year end of the spectrum trying to explain to people on the 1 or 2 year end of the spectrum why that profession is so important. And they're not speaking in terms that 1 or 2 year person understands. So, those cadets, those junior officers, those junior leaders, they just don't get it. And then we muddied the waters by trying to find a place for everybody in the profession of arms, even, civilians, family members, pets, whatever. Well, everybody's a member of the profession of arms and nobody is. And then you completely lose the focus on what the important parts of the discourse are, which is, the profession of arms is something very specific and something very important. And you have to be able to discuss what that means to society. And by talking about it, by writing about it, you could put it in terms that everybody understands. Hey, the Jedi were a profession of arms, and this is why that profession exists, and this is how that profession started to go off the rails, how society started to ignore them. And there's distinct parallels there between, where the Jedi were up to the point where Order 66 was implemented, and where we were during the Forever Wars. The longer we were away at war, the more disconnected we became from society, in the same way that the Jedi had largely become disconnected from their society. And there's great parallels there to discuss, and the Jedi give you the perfect metaphor for being able to talk about where the military profession sits here and now, but do it, using Star Wars and using the Jedi, which I thought was a great tool. And then, I probably spent 10 years looking at the people talking about the profession of arms and the military and saying, you're doing it wrong because nobody's listening. And that was an opportunity to say, here's how you could use something to actually reach people and then spark that discussion that we need to have and hopefully bring people back onto the rails. Because you talk about, Mike Flynn's a great example, the angry little ball of rage. And it's like, he's still part of the profession of arms, and people need to have the discussion of, okay, now where does that put him on the spectrum? How do you deal with retired general officers who refuse to set their rank aside and speak for the profession when they really shouldn't be speaking for the profession? And those are all topics we have to discuss, but until everybody can get on the same page and speak in the same language, you can't have those conversations. And so the Jedi give you that opportunity to get on the same page, and then you can jump from the discussion of the Jedi into Mike Flynn and into the generals that have these great opinions and who want to influence your vote and pick your hot topic of the day. It starts with let's find common ground with a metaphor and then depart from that. And I'm going to give you back to Mike, but that was the great power of Strategy Strikes Back, is being able to draw on those metaphors to really expand discussion on key topics that we needed to hit.
It's the oldest problem on some level, because society must be secured. You must entrust a relatively small group with the gun, and that is a very high responsibility, and we should expect a heck of a lot. How did the Jedi do?
Well, I thought the Jedi, if you look at the Jedi, they did fine. I mean, the Jedi did what they were told to do, but they became so dissociated from society that society generally forgot about them, or they became urban legends. And at that point, you hit something important, which is society depends on the profession of arms to do something that the regular citizen can't, which is to protect and secure them. And so you entrust your profession to do that, but at the point where you start to ignore them and they become an afterthought, you take them for granted, then that relationship starts to break that holds society to that profession. And that becomes a profession in crisis. And I think in a large number of ways, that's where we're at today. And that's something that I still think that every day that goes on, the more that society becomes separated from the profession that it depends on to provide its security and perfection and protection, the closer we get to having a much bigger crisis. And I worry every day that that gap is expanding. It's not closing. And until we can have these conversations with the public, it's not getting any better.
No, I think that's exactly right. And the post 9/11 wars, if you ask Brown University's Costs of War project, will cost the United States $6 trillion out through 2050 if you include bills. Not to mention or gloss over the thousands of U.S. soldiers and probably hundreds of thousands of civilians in those countries. These are the highest stakes challenges and decisions, and we need to be one with the American people as soldiers. It was a chapter that I loved for what it's worth.
Thanks.
Leads me to Afghanistan. The very first, one of those very first emails that I got back from Max, I'd like to write something on the counterinsurgency of the Ewoks. Never enough to throw the Empire off Endor, but enough to distract them from their goal. The battle in Return of the Jedi, the Ewok Tet Offensive, was doomed to military defeat, but it knocked the Empire off balance. Kind of easy to see the connections to Vietnam, the Soviet war in Afghanistan, and maybe Afghanistan today. Gadi has has requested a reading from the book. I'm gonna just do a few paragraphs from Max's work. This is the only time in my life where anyone will want me to read publicly, so I'm going to take this opportunity as my own. This is, I believe, Max, just get me if this right. This is Princess Leia as Senator Leia giving a speech to the Galactic Republic, correct?
Yeah.
Like turning up my speaker for this.
Good. I won't do a female voice. My fellow senators, I write to you on the 1-year anniversary of our glorious victory over the Empire to remind you of those forgotten allies whose courage and sacrifice made that victory possible. Many worlds rose in defiance of Emperor Palpatine's tyranny. Many cultures contributed to his downfall. And yet when the entire rebellion hinged on a final, desperate battle, one race leapt heroically into the fray to strike the critical blow for freedom. Of course, it was the Ewoks of whom I speak, those 11th hour allies who made the difference between victory and defeat, and who need our help as badly as we once needed theirs. So Max continues to describe Endor as a sanctuary for possible threats, that it's a fallen planet, a base to possibly strike the Empire. And
they have proven they can do it. They have taken an Empire force before, in fact, with primitive weapons. And we left them with a very much unspoken word here, religion, which,
right.
If we're not careful, it can come back and bite us in the ass, you know? Just saying.
As Max points out, healing Endor will be expensive. It may require cuts to other programs throughout the Republic. It might even require additional taxes on our citizens. Some of those citizens will grumble. Some will openly resist. They may ask, demand why their hard-earned credits are siphoned off to a faraway land they have never seen to help strange foreign creatures they have never met. We must be brave and honest when dealing with this backlash. We must educate our citizens about the role in our fight for freedom. We must admit our mistakes at that fight's end. We must explain to them, as I explained to you, the dangers of neglecting a former ally. Of course, I understand that many worlds have been devastated by decades of imperial rule. And as an orphan of a destroyed planet, of course, I can sympathize with the plight of those tasked with refusing the shards of a shattered republic. But while we debate on the future of Jeddah refugees and Kashyyyk's truth and reconciliation courts, I urge you to consider the crossroads between empathy and security. Make no mistake, my friends, those roads converge on Endor. We must win peace today to avert war tomorrow.
What I really love about this, beyond the logos of the arguments made, which I loved, don't get me wrong, is the pathos. That's what brought me in to actually acknowledge that. So my favorite line, let me see if I can find it real quick. Okay, here we go. I can still remember the image of a victorious Ewok, arms raised in triumph, brandishing an Imperial blaster, and my stomach tightens at the thought of that blaster aimed at us. And how long before he and those like him decide that they were merely pawns in a grand strategic struggle? I love it.
It's helped by the fact that the image of a victorious Ewok is adorable.
Right. Right. You know, for 20 years in the United States, we've been talking about having the exact same argument over and over and over again about supporting fallen societies, supporting allies in faraway places. How much should we spend on foreign aid? And for me, this was a twist on that conversation, and that was really, really helpful to reconceptualize the argument for me. So it's clear, Max, you wanted to do that conversation from the get-go, from inception. You know, why that? Why that versus, anything else?
Yeah, well, I first was studying the Taliban back in the 90s when I was trying to pitch a documentary series to Court TV about justice systems all around the world. And the more I studied Afghanistan, the more I realized that this was a nightmare of our own making. Because the greatness of America was not winning wars. Anybody could win a war. The Mongols could win a war. but winning the peace. We used to be the masters at that. We used to understand what it took to have a second army behind the first army. First army wins the war, second army wins the peace. And we did this. Anybody who can question this, look at Europe, look at Japan, look at South Korea. You know, when we decided to put our time, our effort, our money into rebuilding a shattered society, it paid dividends for generations afterwards. And somewhere along the line, we lost that. And you not only saw it in Afghanistan, I saw it when I was in Russia in 1994. And I watched this utterly defeated country who knew they were defeated, waiting for us to come in with a Marshall Plan. And it never happened. And look what's happened now. That is of our own making. We created the vacuum that created Vladimir Putin. And I wanted to discuss this of what does it take to understand that you are committed to the post-war society. But how do you do it? Well, you do it with the Ewoks, with the fuzzy wuzzies, which is what the Brits used to call all their colonial peoples. Oh, yes, the fuzzy wuzzies. Which, you know, we talk about the Ewoks. Oh, they're so cute. That's how the Brits used to talk. Oh, yes, the colonial, they're cute. Yeah, yeah, they ain't so cute when they turn their rage on you. But how do you do that? I thought Endor was perfect because it's true. What happens after Nub Nub, right? After they do the dance, you know, and Billy D. Williams is the only one who's actually dancing when the rest of them are just sort of sitting there. But what about the next day when they all just leave and they leave this shattered society, which, by the way, we manipulated their religion to help us win the war, which is exactly what we did with the Mujahideen. So I wanted to discuss that and the idea that when the guns silence, the work is not done.
You know, you're the only one I'm mindful of time, but we finished this book, and I just want to say to everybody here, you know, I felt that we had succeeded when a Japanese Air Force officer barely speaks any English, walked up to me and ripped this patch off his shoulder and handed it to me, having, you know, struggled with trying to read our book. I felt like that was the moment where we had really connected across cultures. And so we did a second book on Game of Thrones and modern strategy. And Max, you wrote about a pawn that gets murdered at the very beginning of that series. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about why you chose that in the second book.
Yeah, well, because when you go to Comic-Con, you see people dressed like Game of Thrones, right? And they're dressed like the Khaleesi or Jon Snow. They're dressed like someone important. You know who they never dressed as? The butcher's son, who accidentally offends Joffrey and is then just murdered, right? This is why, and I'll say this, and I'm sorry, George R. R. Martin, who I'm friends with, I never got into Game of Thrones. I watched every episode and I could never get into it. Why? Because it's about an elite group of people deciding the fate of millions based on nothing more than the accident of birth, right? They didn't run for office. They weren't elected. They didn't have to prove it. They were just born into this, and then they get to decide everybody else's. That's why I thought Game of Thrones was so dangerous, because right now we are in a new era of great power competition. But what are we competing for? No one's ever answered this. Well, this competition is between democracy, a government of the people, and the new Chinese model, which is capitalism without democracy, right? The Chinese model is the Chinese Communist Party at the top. We got this. Go home. Keep your mouth shut. That is going to be the generational struggle of us, our children, and probably our grandchildren, because this ain't going away. So I wanted to write about the butcher's son. He didn't get a vote. He didn't get a lawyer. He didn't get a fair trial. He didn't get any of these things, because when you're trying to teach democracy to people who've grown up with it and take it for granted, how do you do it? What's the language? Well, you tell them, stop thinking of yourself as Jon Snow, because you're not going to be born as Jon Snow. You are the butcher's son. No rights, no privilege, no advocates, nothing. You are at the whim of someone born above you. And if we can think like that, we won't take democracy for granted anymore. That's what I was trying to do with this essay.
You can
Reminds me of the idea that a leader should get a random healthcare fate of their society. Like I love and long for that society. I really would like to quickly ask how you compare and contrast the two worlds that we talked about writing in Westeros and Star Wars, the accident of fate and of birth that gives you the leaders of Westeros, with the sort of accident of birth that gives the Jedi, the powers over the Force.
All right. Well, with the Jedi, that's what Steve was talking about. They're kind of born into it too with the midichlorians. But that actually, I think, also goes to Steve's point, is that the danger of insulation and isolation. When I first spoke at West Point, I talked about how we have a warrior class now in this country. And because military families now are dealing only with military families, we are in danger of creating a warrior caste. And now everybody has stolen that and everybody's writing about it. And I'd love to say, yes, that's because of my genius. No, I took it from a science fiction writer, J. Michael Straczynski, who created the TV show Babylon 5, where the Minbari have a warrior caste. And looking at that, I could make the connection to our own society, that we are in danger of creating a warrior caste. And the danger of that is when it's not your country anymore, and you have all the guns, what's to stop you from turning those guns on your own people that you don't see as your own?
So, Gadi, if it's okay, I've got 3 flashbang grenades in my utility belt.
Go.
Out for a kind of a speed round at the end here.
I was hoping you would pull them out. Please do.
Oh, they're here. So I'm going to ask my speed round question, and then I want to just have each of these guys talk about their most recent project or upcoming production, so to speak. So we'll start with August. Is the United States the empire?
Are we the baddies?
Well, nobody, ever wants to be the empire, but it's one of these narrative questions that I think as a society, we haven't really got a complete answer to. We're at the cusp of this massive transformation with technology, particularly AI. It's coming up in strange places like our politics. It's entered, because of COVID, into business. It's entered into our schools. And now suddenly, I don't think we can tell even what we are, what we're for. I wish it was as simple as deciding we were either on one side or the other in a narrative like Star Wars, but it's far more complex. And to Max's point, increasingly fraught, because we've been at war for 20 years. And that has made a lot of these political questions really difficult to unwind in a political system that's broken and is only going to be more tested by technology, unfortunately, in the next 10 years.
Tell me what you got coming up. What you cooking?
Well, I've been working on a story that was focused on the U.S. Burn-In, novel of the real robotic revolution. Despite having written a book about World War III before that, the next big thing that Peter Singer, my co-writer, were worried about was this question of wither America. And a lot of the work I'm doing right now is focused on these kinds of existential questions around artificial intelligence, the future of robotics, and what it means for conflict. And so, anything I can do to help society, government for that matter, advance that conversation, like I'm leaping right into that.
Okay, I gotta go. Steve, favorite Star Wars character from any part of the broadest part of the franchise?
Oh God, you would ask that question.
I did. Answer.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I always liked Anakin. Even though I didn't like the 3 prequel movies that much, I absolutely loved his evolution as a character into who he became. And then as you move into the movies that we grew up with, his eventual redemption as a character. And I think that's a great story. I think it conveys the idea that no one is ever completely lost, that, you can overcome the mistakes and you can find redemption. And I think that's a great story. And so he was always my favorite. Even though he killed all the younglings, I still liked him. Yeah, I still thought he was a fun character.
Most recent project, what's going on?
So the most recent project is honestly, it's one that all 4 of us are involved in. And working through edits this weekend we ran a very similar project to Strategy Strikes Back and Winning Westeros. We expanded much more broadly to all science fiction, but used science fiction as a metaphor to explain strategy, leadership, conflict, diversity, a lot of the issues that we're dealing with today. And Max, August, Matt, and I all participated in that project. The book is called To Boldly Go, and it publishes on October 7th of this year.
Fantastic. And Max, the work of fiction that whatever it might be, film, book, audio, whatever it might be, that has influenced you the most.
Oh God, the most?
The most. Yeah, I said it. The most.
Of all time?
Yeah.
Oh, it'd probably be the first book I ever bought. I was 16 years old and I bought Hunt for Red October. And as a dyslexic kid, to buy a book, that was a pretty big thing for me. So not only did it suck me in, it educated me and it set me on the course of the writer that I wanted to be, was someone who, when you read my work, I take you for a great ride, but at the end, you think about it.
So I know I'm bumping up against time. So Gadi, I can't thank you enough.
That's okay. We can continue a little bit if you need.
Yeah.
If you need the time, we can give you a few more minutes.
No, I mean, I think we're good. Just in the sense that, I mean, it's a gift to spend an hour with you guys. You know, this is fantastic. This is a good way to spend a Saturday.
Fair enough. Well, I'll say thank you.
Would agree.
I will share that in policy circles around specifically Europe and the United States that are more around cybersecurity, many of us have actually used the book for arguments. Not so much about the chapter number 4, I think, about Stuxnet and the Death Star, that we made more about does deterrence work and how, because some of the, I'll steal 30 seconds here. While Stuxnet was an intelligence gathering tool, it was a spying apparatus, right, or operation. When it was exposed, essentially, many looked at it as a destructive weapon because the centrifuges went too fast. Now, you can argue and say, no, Gadi, Stuxnet was a destructive weapon to begin with. There was no spying operation. If there was, it was separate. And I'll say, okay, I'll accept that much. But once it's detected, once they know it's there, how do you trust your systems to go back in and do it again? Now, when you look to Death Star, there is a choice there, right, to spread fear as a strategy, which actually kind of breaks with all the strategy they've had so far to build their empire. And suddenly, no, we'll just base ourselves on fear, which makes no sense. But, to me, and we can argue the point, but when you look at it, there is a half-life to that in the real world. And that's kind of what I'm looking at when we look at policies around what you do with all of that, when most of the arguments go to places that are easy, such as these weapons are now out there if we help the world against ourselves, which is also kind of in the book. So I've spent a lot of time with this, and I truly am a fan. I truly appreciate the work you've all done here. And I'll mention that about nation building, and finish with that from my own perspective. I was in Estonia in 2007 for the quote-unquote first internet war, and I wrote the post-mortem analysis for what happened there. And some of the things that we have seen that kind of made me understand that I need to look into strategy and policy more, where I'll give you 2 real examples. I was a technical guy, right? One, we saw the internet mail server for the parliament in Estonia under attack. And email is very important. Estonia was an online nation long before any of us. They actually used their email back then in the government. And Hilar was the Estonian state manager, said, I'm drawing a line in the sand, no more. And whenever that server went offline, because the people were speaking Russian online, I won't say Russia for this particular case, said, how dare they? They took it down? No. And they went and brought it back up. And then once again, they brought the server back up, took it down, put it up, took it down. So in a sense, this was more of a military a policing strategy around the broken windows theory. Hey, look here, shiny, right? Keep looking at us. But eventually, they took care of it and they cleaned all the small stuff so that they just left it alone. But at the same time, I can make a claim. I'm not sure that argument was well made, but the first of time I'll move on. At the same time, I am putting money on, I don't have proof for this, they did not attack the banks. At the same time, there was another attack against the president's website. Now, the president is kind of like the Queen of England. He's not the actual ruler of the country, right? He's the head of state, I believe. And there are 20 visitors a week. Now, if you have 20 visitors a week and the bad guys are taking down your website, do you go take care of the banks or do you bring that site back online? So from a strategic perspective or a management perspective, you can say, no, I will not spend my time there. But people got so energized, the attackers got so energized of in taking down that website, they went and attacked more things. And that's kind of just two quick stories to show why I went into understanding strategy more. Understanding it's not all about technology, why the Stuxnet chapter, for example, spoke to me a lot, and as well as the many other chapters, and why I appreciate that people like me can now go and read your books to get an entry into this field and understand the world of strategy. So thank you. I love the book. I love the work. I love all of your works. And we truly appreciate you being here today. And our panelists will stay with us for a few more minutes, and the show is